go.
All right. Good afternoon. I'm Wynn Dunwell, President of International Plant Propagators Eastern Region. And we wanted to take a minute to introduce you to the new Secretary Treasurer, Stephanie Stockton. Now, some of you probably already know her from her previous experience with Perennial Plant Association and with the old American Nursery and Landscape Association Management Clinic. But Stephanie, speak up so they can see you.
Oh, Stephanie.
Thanks, Wynn. I'm honored to join the IPPS family, and I look forward to working with our members. And I see a lot of familiar faces that I've worked with in the past, and I also look forward to working with new friends. IPPS has a storied past and a very bright progressive future, and I'm glad to be a part of that. If you have any ideas on how we can better serve you, please reach out. You can contact me at ippser@gmail.com. And I'm glad that the Eastern Region can offer these micro meetings, and we welcome our friends from across the world today. It's very exciting. And now I look forward to touring the Arnold Arboretum with Sean. And thank you again. Look forward to this. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to just thank Chuck Martin, who is the head of the educational committee for the Eastern Region IPPS, and to go ahead and introduce Liz, who's going to be the host of this one. Well, was the host of the last meeting at Night Hollow. And I'm going to go ahead, Sean, I'm going to just turn it over to you and Liz at the same time. Sean Halloran, which is the plant propagator in Arnold Arboretum, and I'm really excited to watch this. So he's going to throw me off and we're going to go.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Wynn and Stephanie. All right. So I'm just going to quickly set this up. Here we go. All right. So as Wynn said, I am Sean Halloran. I'm the plant propagator at the Arnold Arboretum, and I'm going to be giving you a virtual tour, not as live as Liz's tour was last month. It's a bit more static, just because our building is a 1960s concrete bunker, and it makes it very difficult to walk around with wireless devices. So this will give you a little bit better of a view into what we do. Keep in mind, this really just scratches the surface of our operation, as any of these micro meetings will do, but hopefully it'll just inspire you, sort of give you a taste of what it is that we do. So the Arnold Arboretum is a public park on 281 acres in Boston, Massachusetts. We are a collaboration of Harvard University and the city of Boston. So we actually have a 1,000-year lease on the 281 acres in Boston. And again, we operate it with the city of Boston Parks Department, and it's obviously a living museum with collections and woody temperate plants. So we have around 16,000 accessioned woody plants, and accessioned means just like when you go to a museum and look at artwork, each one of those paintings or sculpture is, there's a provenance, where did this thing come from, who was the artist, and so on. And we have the same kind of provenance information for each one of our plants. So again, around 16,000 accession plants that are, each one of them has a tag, and all that information is related via a database to all that information that we know. So on the right in this slide, you're seeing the Dana greenhouse. It's about 1.5 acres of space with in-ground nurseries flanking the very small propagation style greenhouses. Again, this whole setup was completed in 1962. So each one of the plants that is planted out in this 281 acre park begins here at this very small facility. typically our horticulture staff that works out on the grounds plant out a few hundred plants from this nursery, both ball and burlap and canned material each year. And again, each accession that moves through this area, this production area, typically lives here for 3 to 5 years before they graduate to the living collections. We have a very small staff, just 3 full-time year-round folks with a summer term employee and then generally 2 summer interns. So let's start in the head house, which is where we do, you know, most of our potting work and most of the work that we'll discuss today. But first, I just want to get started with record keeping and how we bring material into the Arboretum. So our records date back to the founding in 1872. And we've always been meticulous about record keeping, especially as it relates to propagation. Right now you're seeing one of those photo metal tags that is on each plant in the living collections. So there, you know, are about 16,000 of these in the landscape. And you see this accession number on the top left, in this case 254-2001A. Basically, this is how we keep track of all this information, is via the succession number. So currently, we maintain paper copies of all propagation records, but our digital database is really the ultimate repository for all this information. Right now, you're looking at a book from 1918, just showing off sort of some of the handwritten records. This being a poplar that was accessioned back then, 100 years ago. And, you know, the whole point of this is to say really that we take our documentation very seriously, and record keeping, as many growers here will know, can be one of the most difficult, but also one of the most rewarding parts of any growing operation. So the propagation cards are really so important because it means that we learn from past successes and mostly failures. And honestly, a lot of what we do is learning by failing, as many people can attest. And really, it's an important way that we move propagation forward. The less that you have to do it because of the foresight of the people that came before you, the better off you'll be at your job. And so I have, you know, 150 years of awesome mistakes that I get to sort of ride the coattail, so to speak, of. This is just an example of a card from 1969. You can see a combination of handwritten and typewritten records there about, you know, 4 different lots of rhododendron seed, talking about where it was collected and so on. So just taking a look at specifically the records that we keep now, the paper records. Some of this will be digitized in the future, and ultimately all of this goes into our database, but just to give you an example of, we initiate a record by creating a new accession number. So this is the year 2020. In the top left corner, you can see 2 accessions from this year, 91 and 92, 2020. So we just start at 1 at the beginning of the year. And this book basically is our running tally so that we don't create duplicate records and we stay on task. So, and then the next down from the top left, you'll see the record cards. So cutting records in green, seed records in white, and then grafting records, sort of a tan color there. And then on the right, the accession form. So this accession form is really where where curation, our curation department starts their record keeping, but on the left is where we record everything about what we're doing to that propagule. So if it's a seed, what kind of, maybe a hormone soak or warm stratification, cold stratification, when we did that, for how long, you know, there's all that information is captured on that card, and then it's also captured on the actual tag that goes into the seed flat, and so on. So for each propagule type, we have a way to capture that information. So propagation at the Arnold really fulfills two main roles. We're bringing in new lineages of plant material to the collections. As you can see on the right, some seed from Japan, Acer diabolicum. But then we're also maintaining existing lineages. You can see on the left just a few photos of the process of air layering a plant that lives out on the grounds and that is desirable and is in some way threatened. Maybe it's threatened in the wild and we want to distribute clones of this population that was collected, or maybe it's threatened at the Arboretum here. And so we're trying to back up this plant via clonal propagation. So, you know, this is just showing air layering, but primarily we're doing this via softwood cuttings in May through August. So softwood and greenwood to get technical, or semi-hardwood. And then hardwood cuttings December through January. And then we're collecting sign material for grafting, you know, roughly December, January through March. So that's sort of our the clonal side of things. Propagation is crucial in maintaining a living museum, you know, as we have here. We basically ensure that the legacy of all plant explorers remains intact by cloning their wild collected material so that we can maintain it ex situ or on the grounds here at the Arboretum. In terms of seed propagation, a lot of the material that we receive is wild collected in temperate forests around the world, with the focus being for us really on North America, China, Japan, and Europe. Most of the seed we bring in has established and maybe even widely published procedures via maybe IPPS, for example, for germination, but it's really the other 5% that makes this job so interesting. Some of the more challenging taxa that we regularly propagate just because of our collections are Stewartia, viburnum, and of course maples, which all often have very complex dormancy requirements, requiring multiple rounds of warm and cold stratification. So in terms of wild collection or wild collected material, you know, this is really integral to the mission of the Arboretum. And because of this massive, because of what we're calling the campaign for the living collections, basically a massive push to, over a 10-year period, collect around 400 different taxa with different provenance or different origination. I have had the immense privilege of wild collecting plant material for the Arnold in the coastal Southeast, and then last year all over Southern Appalachia. So, you know, wild provenance material or wild collected material is very important in terms of ex situ conservation or off-site conservation, as opposed to in situ conservation, which is also, you know, sort of the first line of defense in terms of conservation. So we're not trying to recreate the Southern Appalachian forest or the forests of central China, but rather grow out plants that represent genetic diversity that we encountered there. So moving on. So here's our walk-in cooler. Basically, this is where we cold stratify all of our seeds, and normally this cooler is full of seed fall through early spring. You know, we don't time everything perfectly, but generally most of our wild collected seed is coming in the fall, early winter, after it's been processed. So we generally try to sort of stick with Mother Nature in terms of how we sow seeds So we just organize things by bins, and then each bin has a month label on it. In this case, you can see June 1st, indicating the month which those seed are to go into the greenhouse. And generally we stratify in a mix of moist peat, sand, and perlite, either in this walk-in cooler or in our head house for warm stratification. We also regularly utilize hot and warm soaks for seed, scarify using a file or sandpaper, and rarely, we'll use hormone like gibberellic acid or perhaps some kind of acid scarification for a particularly tough seed coat. So after leaving warm or cold stratification, the seed is sown in our seed house. This range of greenhouses is reserved for seed germination, slight hardening off of seedlings, and then also in the back we do prepare our own media. So that's just an example of some seed, some Cladrastis seed from last year that we received with these radicals already emerging. So it's pretty exciting. So for potting seedlings and containerized trees and shrubs, we primarily use standard mix, Metro Mix 852 or Pfaffer 52 or Pfaffer Nursery Mix or equivalent. But for everything else, for every other application, we basically custom blend mixes that we prepare in the back of this greenhouse. So for softwoods, we use generally 1-to-1 sand to perlite. For ericaceous material like rhododendron, hardwood cuttings, seedling germination, all those different applications, we're going to sort of blend our own from pretty basic ingredients. So just a few shots of seeds germinating. And then obviously a big part of any grow operation is IPM. And our pest management program is primarily centered around beneficial insects. Primarily we're using Delocia, which we are now, thanks to one of our fellows, we're rearing ourselves, road beetles. It's basically just a mix of poultry feed and vermiculite. And this is a, all year round visible beneficial, sort of a good proof of concept for people. Our sort of next down the list is Incarcia formosa. It's a parasitic wasp. And then we also use a lot of Amblyseius cucumaris, a generalist predator, primarily for whiteflies, thrips, spider mites, and broad mites. And then we can use these slow release sachets in the shoulder seasons. And then also green lacewing, Chrysoperla. It's obviously an aphid predator. You can see on the right image there, sort of going to town on an aphid. And eggs are generally applied around Memorial Day for us. Some supporting cast, Aphidoletes and Ophidius. And then pirate bug, Aureus, another ladybird beetle, is obviously another one that maybe a lot of people are familiar with. Sort of easier for a general tour to describe how ladybird beetles, eat aphids and things like that. They are sort of, obviously, for most growers, they're pretty fleeting. So, like I said, most of our operation in terms of pest management centers around those beneficials. The majority of any chemical applications that we do apply are generally centered around our Bonsai Penjing dwarf potted plant collection, just because they are so precious and historic, and perhaps they're a little more stressed out because of the containers that they're in. But otherwise, beneficials have the rest covered. Now, I have to acknowledge that we are fortunate that we don't grow vast monocultures of plants. We grow a very diverse set of trees and shrubs. in our greenhouses, and this combined with having a very small operational size allows us to very easily break cycles. Many growers do not have these luxuries. The other side of this coin is that a lot of our watering is and care is really done by hand, because we have such vastly different plants sharing the same benches. So yeah, this wide range of needs means that we do a lot of hand watering and there's very little automation. So this is our fog house. Obviously this time of year, we're looking at 100% humidity. And then the house adjacent is our hardening house, where we'll, after these softwoods or semi-hardwoods have rooted, those will be hardened off anywhere from, let's say, 60 to 80% humidity until we feel confident to move them to ambient. And then we also have a very limited tropical house where we do have a few accession plants. So the fog house is primarily used for rooting softwood cuttings and greenwood cuttings May through October. As I mentioned, one of our primary missions, one of our 2 primary missions here is to preserve historic lineages that already exist on the grounds. And currently we have a list of about 200 plants that are failing in some way, whether that be mechanical, age-related, or pest-related. But they also could be a type specimen or represent a unique geographic origin. So these 200 plants, we basically, rank them based on the parent plant health, and all this is to say that this is a way that we organize our seasons and what we prioritize. For the average softwood or greenwood cutting, we're using generally an aqueous solution of KIVA, potassium salt of the hormone, for quick dips, and then also a fungicide dip, something like Cleary's. If there's no known procedure, either in our records or industry-wide, we might trial different hormone combinations and concentrations especially for particularly desirable or recalcitrant accession. So occasionally we might also use that fog house as an emergency room for a plant that's knocked over in a storm or otherwise sort of needs that treatment. Greenhouse 3, so this greenhouse primarily used for rooting hardwood cuttings, as you can see here. And these benches are tented and filled with perlite, sand, or in this case, the bench itself is actually filled with peat perlite. And in recent years, we've had a lot of success with Kalmia, rhododendron, metasequoia, just to name a few in these benches. We also harden off potted seedlings in this greenhouse from February to May so that they can transition outside after the last threat of frost. And then last year's softwoods are overwintered in our cold storage facility, which I'll show you later, which is basically just built into the side of the hill behind our greenhouses. And then they'll be transferred back here to be repotted the following spring. Our goal is, once all of these hardwood cuttings have rooted, we pot them on and then empty out this house in the summer months. And then everything transitions outside to basically alleys between the greenhouses and then into our shade nursery. So greenhouse 4, our last greenhouse that abuts that head house that I first showed you. This is primarily used for callousing our grafted plants from January through March via this nifty contraption called a callus pipe. So basically what this bubble wrap thing on the right hand side that you can see, It's basically by placing a heating coil inside of a metal pipe, which is then inside of a larger PVC pipe, and then we cut these vertical notches in it, you can provide warmth directly to the graft union to encourage, callus proliferation or this dedifferentiated cell proliferation. And we usually rotate a few hundred grafted plants through these available spots so that each grafted plant gets some time on this pipe, this callus pipe. For conifer grafts, we do something very similar, except we utilize a small peat tent with part of this callus pipe inside of it. As obviously, conifers require much more moisture as they still are, transpiring even in the winter time. So moving on to cold storage, this little concrete bunker I told you about. This is basically just a temperature controlled overwintering site for all of our containerized plants, big and small. So everything from, like I mentioned, our softwood cuttings that we're rooting right now, to our nearly 300-year-old bonsai trees. They're all overwintered in this small little area. To the left, we'll show you the shade house, which is basically a giant in-ground container where we plant out each accession destined for the collections in groups of 3, 4, 5 and up. So everything from grafted plants, cuttings, seedlings, they all begin their first full outdoor season here. And this is sort of a de facto proving ground for hardiness and any other traits that we're evaluating. So every spring we dig out plants from this tiny little nursery and then transition them to our east, west, and south nurseries. Plants that obviously are not fit for the in-ground nurseries. Maybe it's a quick growing shrub that could just be directly brought out to the collections, or maybe it's a tree that we know is not going to be 100% cold hardy in Boston. We will pot it up into a container and then it will maybe survive its first few winters in that cold storage facility. But really, you really can't see it here, but each alley between the greenhouse is also full of plants. On the west side, the far left of the picture, will be all of our rootstock, and then accession plants will take up the other 3 alleys in between. We've also really started pushing all of our big or large tap-rooted trees into very tall containers, just sort of skipping this process of planting in the shade house, digging up, disturbing that taproot, planting in the nursery, and then 2 or 3 years later, digging that up again, disturbing the taproot again, and then hoping that the tree somehow survives out in the grounds. So we're sort of hoping to circumvent that, the attrition there by just putting them directly into very large containers, let them develop a healthy root system and go from there. So speaking of in-ground nurseries, we have 3 in-ground nurseries that are on the east, west, and south sides of the facilities. These nurseries generally hold plants for anywhere from 1 to 3 years before they can be balled and burlapped by the horticulture crew out to the ground. So this is obviously a big push every spring. Each nursery is, fenced in, and we do have quite a bit of rodent activity all throughout the year now. And so these trees are obviously very precious to us, and so there's a lot of rodent protection in place, a lot of fencing. We do have deer, a lot of rabbits, a lot of squirrel issues. So we do expend quite a bit of energy and investment to protect these trees. So those are sort of the primary missions of the Dana Greenhouse staff and our facilities, but we also have a pretty big job in taking care of a almost 300-year-old collection of trees called the Lars Anderson collection of Japanese dwarf trees, or our Bonsai Penjing collection. So the core of this collection consists of these 5 large specimens of Chamaecyparis obtusa chapuhiba that were started anywhere between 1737, it's our oldest tree, and the 1870s. And they were brought to the US by Lars Anderson, who was a diplomat to Japan in 1913, along with 30 other trees. So this collection has grown quite a bit over the years, and I guess now we say there's about 45 trees, but it's constantly in flux. We've had trees donated to this collection. But one of the most amazing things is that, you know, for at least 100 years that we can document, these trees have been, you know, cared for by Lars Anderson and by Arboretum staff. But before that, going back to the nursery where they came from in Japan, and back to, you know, the early 1700s. So it's a pretty big honor to care for these trees. Now, our staff waters, and we might do some fertilization or some plant, you know, diagnostics for these trees. We don't do any of the repotting. That is left to a professional. We are by no means bonsai penjing experts. But again, it is really a big honor to care for these you know, almost 300-year-old organisms every day. So the collection includes this trident maple, which is pretty incredible. You know, you can see on the left there's a prairie petite lilac, which is a newer addition to the collection. Obviously, that cultivar isn't 300 years old, but we sort of have a range all the way of different age trees, which means we have a pretty robust collection. Obviously, Japanese maples being a big part of the collection, as well as there's another Japanese maple, blue atlas cedar, a weeping plant. A lot of ginkgos. Ginkgo features prominently in our living collections and also in our dwarf potted plant collection. This is a really interesting, what's called a chichi, not the variety chichi, but an underground structure of ginkgo that was actually turned upside down. And it's hard to see the fingers here, but it's a pretty unique dwarf potted plant. So that was a very, very abbreviated tour. I hope you sort of got a sense for what it is that we do here, and how we care for these important collections of historic trees. You know, we obviously want to hear your questions, but if you feel like, you know, your question isn't answered at the end of this, please feel free to just reach out to me directly. It's just Sean_Halloran@harvard.edu. But I would love to, you know, collaborate, hear your questions, and yeah, thank you all for listening to that. Do we have any questions yet, Liz?
We do have questions. Thank you
Nice.
for the wonderful tour, although abbreviated and not quite as fun in person.
Yeah.
Let's see here. We have some questions from Brian Maynard. The first question is, how long have you been in your position at the Arnold?
I have been here for about 4 years. Yeah, Jack left in 2016. Jack Alexander, who a lot of people in IPPS probably know, or have heard of, the legend. And I was really fortunate that he sort of took me under his wing, and I was able to ask a lot of questions about how things work and, you know, obviously tap into 40 years of woody plant propagation knowledge. So I was very lucky to have Jack, and am very lucky to have Jack. I can just call him whenever I want. So it's a very nice benefit.
Yeah, it's a nice legacy.
Yeah.
Let's see here. I got a thumbs up on this question from Brian. Can you go into more depth on your cutting prop of Kalmia?
Sure. Yeah, and I'd be happy if somebody has a very specific question about what we've done with Kalmia. I can certainly look up our records and give you the exacts. But I would say, yeah, we've had a lot of success with. In 2016, we had a lot of success with rooting Kalmia latifolia polypetala, which is a pretty unique mutant that we have a few plants of here. And I believe somewhere in the, we tried a lot of different hormone combinations there, but essentially we rooted, you know, 2 and 3 node cuttings in peat perlite, probably, I believe the end of December, maybe beginning of January. And we had very good success. You know, it was very juvenile tissue that we were able to obtain. So that's obviously a big leg up, but I believe somewhere in the realm of 5,000 to 10,000 ppm KIBA, probably not even a fungicide used. But yeah, if that person wants to email me, I'm happy to send you the specifics if they're, you know, trying to do this as a project or
you could just put it in tissue culture.
Yeah, there you go. Just send it to Liz, you know. Don't bother with all that hardwood cutting
We
stuff.
used to do a lot of Kalmia. Let's see here. Brian asks, what does the name Desideratum refer to in the accessioning records?
Good catch, Brian. So Desiderata is basically a list of desired plants. I mean, it could be desired anything, but that's actually if folks out there are in botanical gardens or arboreta, they probably know the software BGBase. And Desiderata for us is a table name. So it's basically just a collection of all of the plants that we want to repropagate that are desired. But we could also put things in there like if there was a cultivar of apple that let's say the Arnold introduced or somebody introduced and we wanted to get it into our apple collection, we could also add it to the Desiderata table. That's a good accessioning question. Yeah.
One more question from Brian here. You mentioned using a 1-to-1 sand perlite for rooting medium. Do you ever use peat in your mixes?
Oh yeah, for sure. A lot of our, like I said, most of our, if we're just potting a regular seedling, I'll say regular, but just potting seedlings, we're using like Fafford 52, which is, you know, primarily peat, pine bark mix. And so, like I showed in the hardwood cutting area, we're using peat, 1-to-1 peat perlite for rooting, you know, Kalmia, rhododendron, things like that. You know, broadleaf evergreens. So we do use quite a bit of peat, probably much to the chagrin of our UK colleagues that are on this call. But yeah.
Okay, Paul Martin asks, can you go more into depth about the various ways you protect from rodents, squirrels, deer, and other outdoor pests?
That's a good question, very timely. We, our horticulturalist who primarily oversees the nurseries has really been trying to step up our protection there. So number one is the fencing around each nursery. We basically have, you know, chicken wire around each nursery that we can just tape down when we're ball and burlapping. So it has to be a sort of a mobile solution. And then for each tree, we are, you know, we're using a plastic reusable trunk guard, so that, you know, if there is a snowpack and we have rodents moving underneath, we're not getting chewing on the stems. And then also that's obviously just protecting them in the non-snowy season. And then we do spray a lot of organic compounds. We've tried in the past, you know, there's all kinds of things you can try, like these combinations that have garlic oil and putrescent egg solids and blood, things like that, that you're trying to keep away bunnies and squirrels and things like that. So that's, I think it's really, so then there's other products. We just started using one that's basically just capsaicin. So it's just like pepper. That seems to be pretty effective for a short amount of time, but for really sensitive things that we can't afford to lose 1 out of 3 seedlings, you know, just chomped by a bunny. So, you know, we can take the time to spray that, you know, capsaicin or something. And there's one other product, I can't think of the name of it, but it's basically a mix of peppermint, garlic, and it's actually a granule. So we can just apply that around the nurseries, around plants that are getting really demolished by squirrels and bunnies and things. So I really think it's just like anything in IPM, it's sort of like you have to change up your products that you're using just based on the season, and pests get used to these things, and there's no one solution for anybody, right? So.
Okay. Let's see. Derek asks, how effective are the Delodia? Is that how you pronounce it? And
Yeah.
what specific pests do you target? Results vary throughout the year? Question.
Yeah, Delotia is a row beetle, and that's, I think a lot of people, there's a lot of different things that you can control with that. A lot of people use it for, I believe, for fungus gnats primarily. And honestly, that's the only thing we use right now for fungus gnat control, and it's very effective. I'm sure it's taking care of some other things that we don't know about or don't have to deal with. But yeah, I would say, you know, find a good, obviously there are people in IPPS who know much more than me about beneficials. So, you know, find somebody that maybe grows what you grow and work with them to find, you know, what better beneficials might work for you. But I'm definitely not the beneficial expert at all. So.
I am not either. Let's see, Max asked, can you give some more details about your protocol for taprooted species?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, traditionally we've been planting them in the in-ground nurseries, and we are essentially using these like 3 and 4 foot tall, we're calling them top hats, but they're these very long and slender containers. And that's what we've transitioned a lot of, like oaks, chestnut, things like that. We've transitioned to those top hats. We also use air pots. I don't know if people are familiar with those. You might be. And you can get them cut in any size. So you can get a very long and slender cut of that. And so basically between those 2 container types, that's what we're using. And again, it's all to try to minimize the disturbance of the taproot, because we're just finding that digging them out 2 and 3 times, digging them out of nurseries consecutively was just providing a very poor root system. So we're just trying to minimize that disturbance.
Let's see here. Derek asks, what is your water source for propagation in seedlings? Do you use a municipal water source, well, or rainwater?
That's a good question. We do have a rainwater capture system that we're working to get online, but we, for the past 50-something years, have been using Boston City water, which is, I guess, some of the best water in the world. and or at least on the East Coast and of the U.S. Because it all comes from a giant reservoir in Western Mass. So the water is very, it's within very good tolerances. There's no alkalinity. There's no issues whatsoever. So we don't really, obviously I know that there are a lot of people in this world that don't have the access to water that we do. So I understand how privileged we are. But that hasn't really been a concern, except for some very strange cases where we suspect, leaching of copper in our pipes, in the building, things like that. But yeah, we're just using Boston City water, and it's been very good. It's a good question.
Great. So that's all I have from the audience right now. If anybody has anything else, you can just type it in right now. I have a quick question.
Sure.
What kind of changes have you seen with COVID in your own facility there?
I think that's a very good question for any of us. We basically, the institution that I work for has been very responsive to this. And, just internally, I think we're just a very small team. There's right now only 5 of us in the greenhouses. And so we're wearing masks. We're keeping all the windows and doors open as much as we can to keep fresh air. We will be being tested every week, probably starting in a few weeks, just because of the Harvard campus policy. But yeah, I feel like it's been, there's a pretty immediate response, and we've all been really good about sanitizing and trying to protect each other and ourselves. But yeah, we were really scared, like we were just going to have to abandon our trees, right? We didn't know what was going to happen. And I'm sure a lot of growers felt that way, that if we were deemed non-essential by our state and local government, that we wouldn't be able to take care of these trees. And thankfully it hasn't come to that yet. So we feel pretty lucky there.
Yes, definitely. Let's see, I have a question from Colleen. She asks, what resources do you recommend to home gardeners who are relatively new to propagation?
Yeah, if you're focused on woody plant propagation, I would recommend Durr. I would recommend 2 books by Durr. Obviously, the giant woody plant manual, which has a lot of great propagation info in it. And then there's also Durr and Heiser, who's an important IPPS person. Their woody plant propagation tome, which is very exhaustive in terms of pretty much anything that you're going to try to propagate in the landscape and beyond. There's also, I'm trying to think if it's, I would say those are really great places to start. Reach out to people at IPPS that maybe specialize in what you're interested in. I found that most folks are pretty friendly and willing to share if you ask them nicely, maybe buy them a beer or something. But yeah, certainly if it's something woody, temperate, reach out to me. I'll share what we know. But just be open to experimentation and, look at what folks have done in the past, and just know that there's so many variables in plant propagation that your mileage may vary, but there is a lot of great published data out there.
The Durr Bible.
Mm-hmm.
I would just add, don't be afraid to fail, because it's just part of the game. Unless you have one plant and you can only get one cutting off of it, you're gonna fail and you're gonna succeed.
Yeah.
You're mostly gonna fail, and then you'll eventually succeed, hopefully. Which leads me to my next question for you. You did mention that there's a lot of failures and successes. Is there anything recently that you've done that you're particularly proud of, or something that you failed at for a while and all of a sudden had a breakthrough?
Yeah, I can't think of anything off the top of my head where I'm
Yeah,
like, whoa, the success we've had is amazing. Actually, the Kalmia was pretty incredible. And again, I don't have any explanation as to why we were so successful with that. But we actually ended up having more plants than we needed. So that's one success. I would say failures that I'm most excited about. It's like that's really how I feel. It's not just my positive spin on it. Is very difficult to propagate maples. And this is part of it is kind of a success, but it's mostly failures. We do have a number of Asian maples that are very difficult to propagate. One of them being Acer diabolicum, which I showed some seedlings of, but in terms of clonal propagation, it's very, very difficult. And there are some folks that we've collaborated with at the Dawes Arboretum who have had some success with grafting. And we're trying to figure out, how can we get, how can we exchange information about that and all that. But just, Acer diabolicum would be one really very challenging plant that Jack struggled with. I've certainly, obviously struggled with, but it's a really fun challenge, and that clade, that section of Acer of the maple genus is very, very difficult and very exciting to sort of tackle. So if anybody out there is listening and knows, section lithocarpa or Acer diabolicum, please let me know.
Cool. Let's see, we got a couple more questions. Favorite and least favorite species to grow, also from Max.
That's one of those plant person questions that's so mean. I would say I'm very interested in maples. So maybe favorite is to see something like seedlings of Acer diabolicum. If I said my least favorite, I'd probably get in trouble with curation or someone else at my institution. So I'm just not going to touch that one.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
I think we'll probably do this as the last question and
Okay.
wrap it up. We're almost
Sounds
into
good.
an hour. Derek asks, when dipping woody cuttings, you mentioned using a fungicide. Which
Yeah.
ones do you recommend the most?
So, I think every grower sort of has to figure out their own protocol, but I've had a lot of success, or I think I've had a lot of success with Cleary's, which is the product name is 3336F, I think. That sounds right.
Yeah, we use that.
Cleary's, I think, is a pretty good general fungicide. And, you can, I'll make up a small batch of it and use it for several different groups of cuttings. So I think, in terms of not wasting something, that's sort of my protocol. Yeah, that would be what I would recommend to start with. But obviously there's tons of products,
Yeah, Clary's a good one.
and you just
Well,
have to
thank
figure.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing this, Sean. It was great. I
Thank
just have a
you.
couple announcements real quick before we leave everybody. We will have another micro meeting on September 23rd at 4 o'clock Eastern Time. It will be given by Eric Runkle of Michigan State University. He'll be talking about LED lighting for greenhouses. So that's going to be our next IPPS Eastern Region micro meeting. And then we're going to have a IPPS North American Summit. So that will be a meeting in conjunction with the Eastern Region, the Southern Region, and the Western Region of IPPS. So all of the North American regions are going to get together. Since we can't get together physically, we're going to have an online summit. And that will be October 27th to 29th. And each region is going to take a morning or part of the day and have tours and talks from people in our region and also around the world. I know the Western has set up someone from India to speak, so look out for that. It should be great education and also a lot of fun. So thank you everybody from all around the world that has joined us, and thank you Sean again for doing this, and I hope everybody learned something and had a good time here.
Thanks, Liz.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Bye everybody.
Bye.